Welcome from the great state of Texas. I'm Michael,
And I'm Kelly.
and this is 3 in 1, a brand new podcast. Actually, we're in our second show dealing with subjects related to God, any aspect of religion, politics, which is always topsy turvy, and what else, Kelly?
Music.
Yeah, music, something we know a little bit about.
Just a little.
Dealt with all of our lives. Those of you who've been following us on Facebook know that today is a very special time for us. This is part 2 of our inaugural series. We have a very special guest with us, J. Gary Shaw, internationally acclaimed JFK Assassination Researcher and author. And we're looking forward to getting to him in just a few seconds. Gary, can you just say hello to us so everybody knows you're here?
Hey guys, glad to be with you.
Thank you, Gary. Kelly, launch our subject today.
What is our subject today? Today, let's see, we're delighted. We are so delighted to have you here today, Gary. But before we introduce, we really want to do a little housekeeping. There will be some listeners who have a deep, thorough knowledge of what we're about to talk about. But there are going to be some of you who are really new to the vast information related to JFK assassination. So for you, we're going to take a few moments and share just a few of the personalities, entities, definitions related to this event and what happened on November 22nd, 1963.
Yeah, it's been well over 50 years since that event. So for this crash course in Assassination 101, to that end, here we go. Today's focal book is entitled Trauma Room 1, and it was authored by Charles A. Crenshaw, MD, with J. Gary Shaw, and a foreword by Oliver Stone. And we have 2 or 3 contributing authors. D. Bradley Kizia, Gary Anguilar, and Cyril Webb. It's important for those of you out there listening today to know that the Trauma Room 1 is an updated, expanded version of a book that actually came out in April 1992 entitled JFK Conspiracy of Silence.
So Dr. Crenshaw, he's our first personality. He was a high-profile surgeon and well-published medical authority for over 30 years. For 5 years, he was employed at Parkland Hospital and Southwestern Medical School in Dallas, Texas. In 1963, Crenshaw was an attending physician at Parkland Hospital's ER system. He was present and highly involved in the efforts to save President Kennedy's life on that fateful day on November 22nd. 1963. Likewise, he was involved in the life-saving efforts 2 days later to save Lee Harvey Oswald, putting him in Trauma Room 2. And based on the experiences in Trauma Room 1 with President Kennedy, he believes and has written about the existence of an associated medical cover-up. So he further believed that the president's official autopsy photos did not depict the wounds that he saw in Trauma Room 1. He further believed that the president's official autopsy photos, the wounds that he witnessed were wounds of entrance and thus could not have come from the rifle of Lee Harvey Oswald. And oddly, the Warren Commission did not interview him.
Unbelievable. And as I said earlier, when we started our show, that our special guest today is J. Gary Shaw. Many of you already know who he is. Just on a personal note, this is a man who's played a very important role in my life, and we've known each other for a very long period of time. And we've worked together and prayed together, particularly as I've researched over 30 years and written about my mother, Rose Sheremy, whom many of you will recognize that name as the woman who knew about the assassination in advance and tried to warn but was ignored. But more importantly, our guest today is clearly one of the world's most highly respected JFK assassination research authorities and authors. He's authored and co-authored several highly respected books on the assassination, including but not limited to Cover Up, which came out in 1976 with the subtitle of The Government Conspiracy to Conceal the Facts about the Public Execution of John Kennedy. And as I mentioned earlier, he's also co-authored a book called JFK Conspiracy of Silence in 1992, and JFK has been shot. A Parkland Hospital surgeon speaks out in 2013.
I guess the most important individual in this conversation would be the 35th President of the United States, John F. Kennedy. He was assassinated in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963. He was the first Catholic president, age 44, when he was elected to this nation's highest office. He fell heir to President Eisenhower's plan to covertly invade Cuba, resulted in the Bay of Pigs fiasco, thereafter threatened to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces. He challenged America to be the first to land a man on the moon, signed the National Security Action Memorandum 263, ordering the withdrawal of our troops from Vietnam by the end of 1963, 1,000 of our troops by the end of 63, and the bulk of them by the end of 1965. He was assassinated shortly after that memorandum.
Yes, and of course, after Kennedy was assassinated, Lyndon B. Johnson took over at the helm of president after having served with Kennedy as vice president. Johnson became the 36th president of the United States, and some of his most important actions immediately after he took office was signing NSAM document 273 just on November 26th, just a few days after the president was assassinated. This document completely reversed JFK's plan to de-escalate the U.S. involvement in Vietnam, a really important shift in our governmental approach to that war.
What you're seeing in front of you now is Parkland Hospital, Dallas, Texas. Now, these are pictures from 1963. Parkland Hospital was the University of Texas, Texas Southwestern Medical School's primary teaching facility. In 63, it was home to a level 1 trauma center, and it was the only hospital in Dallas County that could have even hoped to have provided an advanced trauma care in 1963.
Thank you, Kelly. Also, it's important to just make a note that the trauma room number 1 at Parkland Hospital, the day Kennedy was brought there, was full of doctors and other personnel. Some of the main doctors who were included in the room are Red Duke, Charles Baxter, Jim Catterco, Malcolm Perry, Charles Crenshaw, Kent Clark, Robert McClellan, Ronald Jones, and Pepper Jenkins. And we'll get more to those characters here in just a few minutes. Next on our list of subjects for Assassination 101 is an introduction to a very important journal of the medical world, sponsored, published by JAMA. It's called the Journal of the American Medical Association. It is an internationally acclaimed, peer-reviewed medical journal published almost 50 times a year by the American Medical Association, and it covers literally all aspects of biomedicine. Next is the Warren Commission. Kelly, tell us about this really important factor.
Well, the Warren Commission was established by President Lyndon B. Johnson. Its purpose was to investigate the assassination of President Kennedy and to evaluate matters relating to the assassination and subsequent killing of the alleged assassin, and to report its findings and conclusions to President Johnson. The commission concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald acted entirely alone in murdering President Kennedy. The commission's findings have proven controversial and have been both challenged and supported by later studies.
Yes, and next in our listing of subjects for our class today on the assassination is the House Select Committee on Assassinations, commonly referred to as HSCA. The final report of the HSCA presents, obviously, the committee's findings in the murders of President John F. Kennedy and Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. In reference to the Kennedy assassination, it's important to note that the HSCA found a probable conspiracy in the assassination but unfortunately, they were unable to determine its nature or the participants other than Oswald, who was still deemed to have fired all of the successful shots that day. Also, of great importance from that point forward, all of the documentation related to the assassination was sealed up tight till 2029, and except for the documents that were released during President Trump's administration, we've still got documents that are under lock and key till 2020.
And I'm sure there were some released previous to that. We're going to talk to Gary about that in a little bit when we bring him on shortly.
Absolutely.
Right after that, later on in 1992, as a result of JFK, the movie, Oliver Stone's movie, JFK coming out, and probably this book that Gary and Dr. Crenshaw authored together, we had the John F. Kennedy Assassination Records Collection Act. And the Records Collection Act resulted in a review board, the ARRB. It was a unique solution to nearly 30 years of government secrecy. It required the government to release whatever information it had regarding the assassination. An independent board, the Record Review Board, the Assassination Records Review Board, created by the JFK Act, would oversee the government's implementation of the act.
Absolutely. So now that ends our class, Assassination 101. Thanks for your patience, those of you who are really familiar with the subject, and we certainly hope that helps some newcomers get a little bit of foundation about today's subject matter. Now, the most important part of our show, getting to our guest. Now it's my time to welcome our longtime Treasury friend and mentor. As I said earlier, he's the foremost Kennedy assassination researcher and expert, having investigated the murder for well over 50 years. In my opinion, no one knows more about this subject than our guest. So please join me in welcoming Gary Shaw to today's podcast. Gary, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you guys for having me on. It's a real honor to be the second person on this great podcast you guys are initiating. So I'm glad to be with you.
Thank you, Gary.
Gary, I'm so glad.
Let me give a little disclaimer right quick, though. There are no experts in the Kennedy assassination. There's some of us who have studied it and investigated it and written about it that know more than most people. Unfortunately, most of the people who don't know about it happen to be in the media, and they're the ones that write about it, and therefore they're the ones that have kept the American people in the dark about this criminal act back in 1963. So when the public is not fed good information, they don't learn the truth.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, you've written several books on the assassination. The first being the highly acclaimed Cover-Up, which we see right here on the screen. And you have co-authored a book with Dr. Crenshaw, a surgeon who was in Trauma Room 1 and 2, later on with Lee Harvey Oswald. He also was in and out of Trauma Room 1 on November 22nd as he checked in on Governor Connolly. The book entitled Trauma Room 1 was originally published in 1992 as JFK Conspiracy of Silence. In the book, Crenshaw revealed what he never had a chance to tell the Warren Commission. So Gary, tell us and tell our audience how you became involved with Dr. Crenshaw and how the books came out.
Well, first, let me explain the subtitle to the first book I wrote. That originally came out in 1976. It was called Cover-Up, and the subtitle was The Conspiracy to Conceal the Facts About the Public Execution of John Kennedy. The reason I phrased that in that way, also in the motorcade that day, right behind the president when he was shot, was the soon-to-be president, Lyndon Johnson. And it's my belief that there was a cover-up of the facts in the matter, which is proper suspicion of guilt. It was the government that covered up the facts, but also it was a public execution. People used to do that early on in the United States, and there would be great crowds to see a guy hung, for instance. And they did that because they thought that would make the younger folks realize that there's punishment to their crimes, and it would be something they could stay away from. I think this one was public, and in the manner in which it was done, there's many ways they could have gotten rid of President John Kennedy, but they killed him right in front of the President Johnson, and I think it was a warning to him. So I met Dr. Crenshaw early in, I guess it was late 1990 when I first met him, and we had opened a museum type information center in Dallas, Texas, and we were getting all kinds of publicity and people coming in giving us information. And one day I'm there and I get a phone call, and it was for Dr. Crenshaw, and he wanted to get with me and talk about helping him write a book, a memoir of his days, 3 days at Parkman, you might call it, because there were 3 days that he worked anxiously and tirelessly, helping try to save not only Kennedy, but Lee Harvey Oswald, but also Governor at the time, John Conley. So that's how I met him. He came to see me, and we agreed to put our heads together, and that's how Trauma Room 1 came about. First is Conspiracy of Silence, and then is Trauma Room 1 and updated, and then later as JFK Has Been Shot, a much updated book of the previous publication.
Interesting.
That
Thanks
answer
for
your question?
clarifying that sequence. Yes, appreciate it. Gary, that's fascinating. I'm just curious, were you shocked when Dr. Crenshaw walked in? Were you shocked to meet him?
I was not shocked as much as I was excited, because we had already had a number of people come in with additional information about what really went on there, but also what went on in Dealey Plaza there in Dallas, where the president was shot. And we felt we had opened up an area of information that we could get out to the people that they had never heard before. And so when he came along, I was very excited about it.
Wow. So near the time you and Dr. Crenshaw released the book, then Oliver Stone created some serious waves with the release of his landmark film, JFK. And so for the first time, many Americans were confronted with the visual depictions that threatened the official assassination story set forth by the Warren Commission and the HSCA. So if I remember, millions of dollars surfaced from the Warren Commission lawyers, all designed to counter Stone's film and books like Conspiracy of Silence. Several set the record straight, and I use that in quotes there, air quotes. Set the record straight books and articles by prominent writers appeared in bookstores and journals across the country. And later, a variety of lone assassin documentaries surfaced. So each of these media were designed in full support of the lone assassin theory. So we're talking about examples like what we have on the screen here: Case Closed by Gerald Posner, Oswald the Lone Assassin, Norman Mailer received a really big contract, I understand. Posner's book received a huge advance for its publication. Reclaiming History, the Vincent Bugliosi, also received a major contract. There were various articles by Max Holland, who's down here at the bottom right, who was paid to write for the CIA's in-house magazine. Holland received a major grant from the CIA academic Front Foundation, was finally financially backed by a German-Jewish Venetian blind company. I find that interesting. So give us some feedback. I'd like to know more about these responses and their huge money backing and their response to you and Dr. Crenshaw and Oliver Stone.
Well, it was kind of a fluke the way this all came together. When Dr. Crenshaw first came to me, there was scuttlebutt about a movie, but not much information. We didn't know a whole lot about it. But so we started writing probably a year prior to the release of JFK. And when JFK came out in November of 1991, I believe, man, it blew their dress up, so to speak. And there was a lot of excitement and information that came out in that made people really question the government's decision to proclaim Lee Harvey Oswald as the lone assassin in this case. So about a month or two after it came out, it was so popular and there was such a clamor that our agent with the book company called and said, we're going to push you. We want that book not out next October as planned. We want it out in April or May. And so we went hard to work. And when the book was released as Conspiracy of Silence, it shot immediately to #1. The JFK was part of the reason for that, but Dr. Crenshaw was on 2020 telling the story just prior to the book's actually on the day that the book was released. And so it shot to #1, and it was a heady time for a young guy who's an architect in Cleveland, Texas, and really was not a writer. So
interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we haven't really said much about your life before the JFK assassination. You were indeed a certified architect and worked all over the country. Let's just interject a second. What made you step away from that? How did you get to that point?
I really didn't step away from it. I slowed down on it. I had a very successful practice, and at that time I was registered in about 24 states, and I was traveling pretty well all over the country. And I decided I didn't want to do so much traveling. I wanted to be with my family, and so I had always been interested and studied and investigated the Kennedy assassination since the time it happened. And that's another story we may get into, may not. But anyway, I continued, but not as active in architecture. As I wrote these books. I wanted to say something too. When my friend Bill Kelly, who's a researcher and critic, wrote a little article after Oliver Stone's movie, and I wanted to kind of read it to you because it pretty well tells exactly what happened when the JFK came out and when Conspiracy of Silence became so popular and became a #1 bestseller. He wrote, when it was apparent that Oliver Stone's movie JFK was going to make serious waves and threaten the official version of events, the U.S. News and World Report published a short news item that former Warren Commission lawyers had met in Washington, D.C. and accumulated a $4 million war chest to counter Stone's film. I don't know where the money came from, Kelly writes, or where it went, but over the next few years, just as Kelly has pointed out, there was money to be spent, and Norman Mailer and Gerald Posner and Max Holland and these kind of people were able to publish books and continuing to propagate the lone assassin, lone nut theory for the president's death. So I wanted to, who does that? Why is the government so interested in perpetuating a myth? Because that's what it is. But they were, and they got together and got $4 million and really fought this conspiracy angle in the president's death.
It's interesting if you have nothing to hide. If all of the evidence leads to their conclusion, what's the point of that? Right.
That's what we ask. And each one of those guys are liars. I don't mind I can't say it any in any other way. I guess I could try to be kinder, but Posner lied, Mailer lied, Bugliosi lied his teeth out, and so did Max Holland. And many of these guys, there's no doubt in my mind, knew they were telling lies or were accepting facts they knew were wrong. And they knew that their silence was important, and if not ordered. And they knew that witnesses had been intimidated, ignored, inadequately interrogated, all of these things. And I was amazed one day. I was watching, this was years ago, but it amazed me that Phil Donahue, the Donahue show, Richard Helms appeared on it, and he didn't make many appearances like that. He was at that time, former CIA director, and but he kind of gave us a rare and revealing glimpse into the reality of keeping secrets and propaganda and so forth. A lady asked him from the audience, why he had been talking about secrecy in the life of John Kennedy. While Kennedy was in office and all, nobody wrote about all of the affairs he was having, and they knew about them, but they didn't write about them. And that was the way with other politicians and so forth. They just kept it secret. And he was asked a question: why didn't people speak up at that time? And here's what Helms said: at the time, for several reasons. One, you don't know the facts at the time. Secondly, in all of these cover-ups, for example, the Secret Service knew all about John Kennedy's womanizing, but they had a conspiracy of silence. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Why? Because they worked for John Kennedy. It's very difficult in real time to get people to talk, particularly when there may be sanctions against them. And the young lady who is 25, who wants to take on those powerful figures, talking about the lady who asked the question, sometimes by saying something she knows about them, does so at her own peril. He says, I don't want to emphasize that anything is going to be done to her, but by the time the newspapers and somebody gets through with her, she'll wish she hadn't done it.
Man, that's amazing.
That's
outright threatening.
It is, and it's what happened, and that's the key to what's happened in the Kennedy case.
All of this pushback, the raising of this $4 million, and all the pushback that came in many forms, particularly toward Dr. Crenshaw when, he got right in front of the camera on ABC's 2020. Those of us who are over 50 remember that 2020 was a hugely popular show, interviewed by the likes of Barbara Walters, guest interviewed by her, Hugh Downs, and others. It was just amazing what Crenshaw said on this show, and the pushback from JAMA, the media, and other powerful entities was just overwhelming. Let's take a moment and pause here to see a brief excerpt from Dr. Crenshaw's revelatory 2020 interview.
Right.
We ran into the emergency room, and there was bedlam, total bedlam. People were running in. People were crying.
Did President Kennedy have any vital signs when you reached the...
He had barely a pulse. He had an agonal respiration. He had no blood pressure whatsoever.
Did you see the tide, his life, in effect, running out?
Yes. However, God love him, Malcolm Perry. He didn't want him to die as much as all of us. He started closed chest massage, pumping on his chest, trying to make him come back or resuscitate the heart.
After the medical team had done their best, had worked as hard as they could and realized it was hopeless, was there time for tears among those who had put so much emotion and effort into this?
Just before the cleanup really started, there was blood and bandages on the floor. His back brace was askewed on the wall. I think it got to me most when I looked and saw the red roses of Mrs. Kennedy in the kick bucket there at the head of the table. And there his blood was still dripping on it. Felt helpless. I wished we could have done more. I mean, here we had trained all our lives and we'd lost the President of the United States, and nobody wanted to be around. And Mrs. Kennedy came in, and she stopped and kissed his great toe. And then she went on the right side to hold his hand. And at that time, she took her ring off and put it on his small finger. And then he was wrapped in a sheet, and we placed him in a coffin. But before we did, I looked at the wound again. I wanted to know and remember this the rest of my life. And the rest of my life, I will always know he was shot from the front.
Wow. That is a powerful, powerful interview. Although I've seen it many times, I'm really taken by Dr. Crenshaw's demeanor during this interview. This looks like a man who is deeply grieved by what he's had to walk through and is fighting against, in some ways, against all odds to tell the truth. Sadly, I'm imagining that there are millions and millions of people out there under the age of 50 who've never seen this interview. But it's certainly easy to understand how this interview drew so much attention from lone nut propagandists like those at the helm of JAMA. I believe that the JAMA articles stated that they thought that the book that you and Dr. Crenshaw did was a complete fabrication. Specifically, Gary, was JAMA claiming that Crenshaw was lying? And can you introduce our audience to the perfect storm that descended on you and Dr. Crenshaw?
Well, it was only a few short weeks after this interview and after the success of the book and its popularity with the people. When we wrote it, we wanted to write a short, concise, easy to read book, not in great detail, but telling the complete story of what happened those 3 days and what happened around it. And when it became popular, somebody felt that there was a threat to the false myth story that they'd been telling through the years. And it obviously, I don't know who called up the head of JAMA magazine and the American Medical Association, but somebody put pressure on them, and they immediately sent a writer and hired a writer to do a story and interview the doctors at Parkland that were around, and also the doctors who performed the autopsy on President Kennedy in Bethesda, Maryland. And when they did that, all of them called him a liar, that he was wrong about the wounds. He was wrong about the shots having been fired from the front, which would have been impossible for Oswald to fire from the back of the president. And so there was a storm, and they immediately held a press conference, issued a magazine that condemned and called Dr. Crenshaw and me a liar. And they did so on national television and standing in front of the big seal of the American Medical Association. And the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Dallas Morning News, the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, every major paper in the country did editorials calling Dr. Crenshaw a liar, basically. And so it was a devastating time to us. We were high as a kite. because of the popularity of the book. But we got shot down pretty quick after that.
You know, what Dr. Crenshaw said in the book must have truly concerned the powers that be. His statements obviously directly contradicted much of what the Warren Commission actually stated. Can you talk to us just a few minutes about the major claims that Crenshaw made in the book?
Yes, they're on the screen, and that's good, because when we wrote and updated that book as JFK has been killed, my whole chapter that I added was about exposing the real fabricators. And these are the 6 points that I pointed out. Here's what Dr. Crenshaw said that made them so mad. Number one, that he participated in the treatment. He didn't say he was top dog. He said, I participated in the treatment of President Kennedy at Parkland, and that he observed. He was not the only one. All of them pretty well observed both Kennedy's head wound and his throat wound. And in his medical judgment was that both wounds resulted from shots that struck President Kennedy from the front. And the autopsy photographs, one of the things that Dr. Crenshaw did right after he and I became acquainted is that he came to the center and I showed him color photographs of the autopsy of President Kennedy that he had never seen. And when they were shown to him, they depicted wounds that were incompatible with the nature and location of the wounds he saw in the emergency room. That flew in their face.
Yes.
And number 4, many of Crenshaw's Dallas colleagues reported the wounds to be in the same location and to be of the same nature that Crenshaw, had observed. And they had. They were on record in written statements right after the shooting and after the treatment of the president. They wrote out statements. He also said he participated in the treatment of Lee Harvey Oswald on Sunday, November 24th, when Oswald was brought to Parkland. And he made the statement that while Oswald was being treated, he was called on the telephone in the operating room where he talked to President Lyndon Johnson, the new president, who told him there was a person present in the operating room to take a deathbed confession from Oswald. And they poo-pooed that. One of them said, the president calling for Dr. Crenshaw, baloney. And of course, Dr. Crenshaw never said the president called for him.
Exactly.
He was tapped on the shoulder and asked if he could take the call. He was the least busy at the time. And so he went and was shocked when President Lyndon Johnson came on and gave him these orders. And there was a person in there, still had a pistol hanging out of his pocket. I don't know what that meant, but he had put on the garb of an operating room surgeon and was waiting there. One of the guys came over and shouted in Oswald's ear, "Did you do it? Did you do it?" And
Oswald laying on the table, fighting for his life.
Yeah. And of course, that's another story. But those are the things I wanted to point out. This is what they said he was lying about, and the fact of the matter is, he was telling the absolute truth in the face of their lies.
Wow. So, what Crenshaw saw and described, particularly the damage that caused Kennedy's skull and brain matter to exit backwards and even onto the limousine trunk lid, exactly where Mrs. Kennedy crawled to retrieve the flying matter, really throws cold water on the fatal missiles coming from the rear. So obviously this opens the door to additional shooters. So many of our listeners today, Michael and I are both teachers, and I am very surprised at the amount of people who have zero knowledge, number one, about what we're talking about. They have never seen the very short video clip that we're going to show our viewers today. So give me just a second. I want to show this very short clip from the Zapruder film. And once we've done that, in your opinion, and in light of your multi-decade research, were there multiple shooters in Dealey Plaza that day? So give me a minute, and once this clip finishes, we'd like for you to speak to this.
Okay.
So what do you think, Gary?
We
What
could
about
talk
the shooters?
we could talk days and days about what went on in Dealey Plaza and what the evidence actually shows. But one of the things that I think Kelly is talking about is Jacqueline was standing or sitting right there beside him. And when the shots hit him in the head, she saw a piece of his brain fly backwards from the back of his head and land on the trunk of the limousine. The motorcycle patrolman that was riding next to her on the left-hand side was hit with blood and brain tissue with such force, he said, I thought I had been hit. And that indicates that there was a shot from the front of the president, not from the back.
Yes.
And she jumped on the back of the trunk and picked up that piece, still had it in her hand when she got to Parkland Hospital. She testified to the Warren Commission, and they deleted that portion of her testimony where she talks about that. And it's quite revealing what the government tried to hide. They even reversed the two frames, and when they published the document showing the Zapruder film, they reversed the two frames that show the headshots, and which negated the the forceful backward movement of President. His whole body was picked up and thrown back against the back seat. And so definitely there were shooters from the front.
Well,
At least a shooter.
just to follow up a little bit with that, in the book, in yours and Dr. Crenshaw's book, you make the writers make reference to the fact that had that bullet come from the rear with the force that it took to blow out the back of his head, it would have actually blown out his face.
That's right. Absolutely. One of the strange things, and I disrespect, in fact, I despise the media who have tried to sell this. Dan Rather, maybe your listeners don't remember him, but he was very popular.
We remember.
Newsman back in those days, but he was in Dallas, and he was one of the first reporters to see the Zapruder film. They played it for him on Friday evening, and he came on the air after he witnessed the movie and gave a report on it, and he was told a very honest report about what happened and what the film showed until he got to the head wound. And he said the president's body went forward with considerable violence.
Wow.
It never once went forward.
Never once.
So that was one of the very first lies that the media gave us, indicating that the cover-up had begun very, very early.
You know, it's not too hard to understand how the Zapruder film, Crenshaw's wound observations in Trauma Room 1, and we haven't even talked much about the Dealey Plaza and Parkland witnesses that spoke against things like you just referred to that were being reported on the media. It's not difficult to understand that really created a need for those in charge, whoever they are, to concoct and manipulate every post-assassination fact. can you talk to us a little bit about such kinds of exerted pressure on people?
Well, there was so much of it going on, and what they did is they ignored many of the witnesses. There is a vast majority of the witnesses who told authorities that the shots that were fired at the president came from the front, the right front. In fact, there were 21, believe it or not, 21 law enforcement officers in and around Dealey Plaza at that time. These are guys experienced with guns and the sound of bullets and so forth. Without exception, all 21 of them said that the shots came from the president's right front.
Wow.
Unbelievable.
Wow.
You know, how the media, could go against that. I mean, it's just incredible to me. When I hear all this stuff over and over, of course, I thought about it and read about it for a very long time. It's still dumbfounds me.
Yeah.
But
Go ahead.
it's really sad. Number one, I'll just hold this up for you. This is a CIA document that came out in 1967. 1967. There was a lot of blowback, and let me just read you a couple of things. One is this is a document countering criticism of the Warren Report, and they say that the aim of this dispatch is to provide material for countering and discrediting the claims of conspiracy theorists. The action they wanted was first of all, they do not recommend the discussion of the assassination question be initiated where it is not already taking place. In other words, keep your mouth shut about it. Don't tell. And then it goes on to say, discuss the publicity problem with liaison and friendly elite contacts, especially politicians and editors. Ring a bell?
Yes, it does.
Then they said employ propaganda assets. Now, if you're telling the truth, you don't need propaganda.
Indeed.
Our play, the CIA, should point out as applicable that the critics are, one, wedded to theories adopted before the evidence was in, politically interested, number three, financially interested, number four, hasty and inaccurate in their research, or number five, infatuated with their own theories. In other words, they wanted them to attack the messenger and not get into the message. They might have to confront truth if they got into the message of the messenger. So
Indeed.
That's part of the problem with our country right now.
I understand. As you implied earlier, there's so many things we could discuss. I can't help but think about the Secret Service presence, the FBI presence, the removal of the limousine, on the heels of one of the nurses commenting that the windshield framing looked like it had been damaged from a bullet. Then the disallowance of a lawful Texas on-site autopsy by Dr. Rose, confiscation of Kennedy's clothing, and improper handling of the missiles or fragments from Kennedy's body. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. The unusual pressures and early actions of covering up.
Well, we always said a Bowery bomb that they picked up off the street that somebody had killed would have gotten a better autopsy than President Kennedy did. And that's not an exaggeration. That's not a stretch. It's funny about the limousine. There was actually a hole in the limousine indicating a shot from the front.
Where was that? Do you know?
Yeah, it was in the windshield just below the mirror.
That's what I thought. I just wanted to be sure.
Yeah. And in fact, one of the policemen said you could put a pencil through it. And, there were several witnesses that talked about that hole in the windshield. By the way, the limousine was taken immediately to wash. Well, it was washed out first.
Yeah.
They had buckets of water and we're cleaning up. That's destruction of evidence, destruction of a crime scene. But they took the limousine and immediately took it to Dearborn, Michigan, and tore it apart, threw the glass away, and rebuilt it into a totally different limousine. We have the Ford's Theater. You could go see where Lincoln was assassinated. It's a historic landmark. Well, that limousine was a traveling Ford's Theater.
Yes.
It's a landmark and should have been preserved, but it should have been treated as a crime scene, and it was not.
Yes. The level of control by the powers that be was astounding and shocking from the beginning. And it continued as Air Force One flew to Washington and delivered the president's body to Bethesda Naval Hospital. So this picture on the left is Bethesda Naval Hospital, where the autopsy took place. So give us an overview of how the autopsy was handled and by whom.
Well, the three men you see there were excellent at autopsies. There's no doubt about it. But they had no experience in wounds of bullet wounds and wounds of that nature. None. And they called on these three to perform the autopsy when it should have been done legally and ethically and by a professional. And Dallas had one of the great ones in Earl Rose. And, that was evidence that the body of an accident victim or a shooting victim is the best evidence. And they treated it like it was not. And the autopsy was performed under military control. In fact, there was a general up in the seating section that looks down on the autopsy table. This is a training center too,
Right.
And he actually gave orders: do not dissect the wound in the back and throat. In other words, don't trace where that bullet went. We don't want to know whether either one of them went. They wanted to lie about it and say the one in the back came out his throat, and not as Dr. Malcolm Perry, who examined that real close and said it was definitely a wound of entrance in the president's throat. Again, from the front. It's hard unless Oswald could bank a shot off the concrete overpass, and I don't
Bounce
think
it back.
And I don't think
even now, I'm just dumbfounded at the coordination of deception. Part of me is astounded that in many ways it really held together, the deception.
It's funny, Allen Dulles, who had been fired by Kennedy as CIA director prior to this, was appointed on the board of the commission. He was one of the commissioners, and he made the statement, and this is on record, that people won't read. They won't look into this, I think they actually thought they could blow smoke at us and pull the wool over our eyes or whatever. And we're not that stupid.
Well, Gary, even now, almost 60 years after the assassination, controversial issues swirl around the subject of irreconcilable differences between the wounds observed and photographed at Parkland and Bethesda versus Parkland versus Bethesda Naval Hospital. So also the ARRB released documents have revealed for the first time that the HSCA misrepresented the statements of its own Bethesda autopsy witnesses on the location of JFK's bullet skull defect. That's on page 209 and 210, I think, of the JFK has been shot. So what issues are we facing here?
Well, the issue is that the AARB caused the release of documents that they wanted to conceal and hide. And one of the lies that the second investigation, the House Select Committee on Assassinations, they came up with the conclusion that the doctors who said that the wounds were caused by shots from the front were just wrong. And, and that was not true. That's what we were told. And we found out that actually the wounds that the Parkland Hospital doctors saw and the autopsy doctors originally talked about were exactly the same. And you've got a slide up there showing drawings of the wounds to the president's head. The 1 second from the left is the one actually drawn by Dr. Robert McClellan,
Yes.
who was one of the major surgeons in the room that day. And that's nothing like what you see on the far left, which
Exactly.
is what the Warren Commission, the Warren Commission would not show the president's autopsy photographs or his wounds or anything of that nature. So they had an artist come in, and I'm going to hold this up for you because this is a little indication. Can you see that?
Yes, I can.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
This one right here is from the Zapruder film frame that is right before the bullet strikes the president's head. That's the position of the head. Look at what they had the artist draw.
Yes.
Wow.
And they put a small hole in the back of his head, nothing like the large hole that Dr. McClellan saw.
Bellinger.
And they cock his head over so that the bullet will be a downward trajectory, which, is that matches what they said Oswald did. But if actuality, if you place the head like it really is, and turn the president's drawing that you see here in the same position that's here, the bullet trajectory is one from the lower back. They would have to be from the Secret Service car or the sidewalk or someplace like that. They did the same thing with the throat wound. House Select Committee twisted the president's body into this position in their drawings. They wouldn't show the autopsy photographs either. And in actuality, if you put the wound exactly where it is, which is about 4 to 5 inches below where they said it entered, and we have evidence of that, then that trajectory is also in an upward path and could not have been fired by Oswald from the 6th floor window of the school book depository. So there's a lot of problems with it, but to find out that the House Select Committee actually lied about what the Parkland doctors and what the autopsy doctors saw is, it's a lie that really should concern all of us, because when you look at it from that standpoint, they told us a lie that, it means the government was still covering up the murder.
Wow.
Exactly. It's obvious that the actions were designed to detract. I mean, there were certain things that were not done to the wounds, like JFK's brain and other wounds. Help us, without getting too technical, help our audience understand about what was done and what was not done that should have been done in the processing of those wounds.
Well, there's several things. Number one, let's just take the headshot, for instance. There was a portion of the brain, JFK's brain, that was blown out, so that was not all there.
Right.
But in a autopsy where there is a wound of the brain is removed, it's set in a formalin and allowed to harden, and it's taken out maybe several days later after it's had a time to set up, and it's actually sliced like you would slice a loaf of bread.
Yes.
And that way they could trace whatever happened to that brain, where the bullet came in, where fragments of the bullet went or bone fragments went. In other words, they could trace the trajectory of the bullet and therefore determine whether it's an in shoot or an out shoot and all of those things. They also would not allow a probing of the so-called back wound and throat wound. You look at the bottom picture there of the president's throat. They slit him like a butcher.
Indeed.
And that did not happen at Parkland Hospital. That's the way the body arrived at Parkland, but I mean at Bethesda. But that's not the wound that the doctors saw at Parkland. They saw a small round hole with a little bit of staining type things around it. That would debris from a bullet penetrating it. And all the doctors said it was a wound of entrance. But when it got to Parkland, that had been removed. The president's throat had been cut. I think they were going after a bullet that had lodged back there against his spinal column. But I'll never be able to prove that. I know that a missile was taken into evidence at Bethesda, but they don't say where it came from.
Wow.
The back wound that you see on the left, they had the president's shirt and coat, and both of them measured from the collar down to the bullet hole in the shirt and the coat at about 6 inches. Well, they moved this up. In fact, Gerald Ford even changed what the committee the commission was going to write about it, and wouldn't call it a shoulder wound. He wanted to call it a neck wound. Well, 6 inches down from the top of the collar of your suit and shirt is not a neck wound.
That's
No,
right.
it is not.
Part of the lie. One
That's
of the
right.
things about the whole thing is they can never ever analyze the trajectory of the bullet. They don't know the exact position of the president in the automobile when he was hit. They don't know the horizontal or vertical angle that penetrated his body and his head. They don't know any of these things, and it's impossible. They tell us they do and can, but they didn't and they can't.
Wow. And Gary, this is only the beginning of the conversation regarding incomplete and inaccurate evidence. Perhaps we should touch briefly then on the issue of how authorities assigned bogus wound locations and ignored bullet pathways to the president's body. Why was this done?
Well,
Yeah.
I don't know how to answer that, because I don't know why they did it, other than that they wanted to conceal the facts about the president's death. They could not, for some reason, have a conspiracy. And so you've put up a drawing that I did back when I did Cover Up in 1976 that showed the amazing path of the magic bullet, we called it.
Right.
And that was that the bullet came from the assassin's gun 60 foot high into his rear right-hand side. And the bullet hole that hits 6 3/4 below the collar of the shirt in his back actually has to go upward, has to turn and go upward to come out and make a bullet hole just above his tie knot in his neck. And not only that, they said this bullet was the one that wounded Governor Conley. To do that, and I show the downward trajectory that it has to be to go in Conley, because they actually did probe his wounds and get an angle horizontally and vertically through his body. So it had to actually come out going upward and pause in midair and turn to the left, turn to the right and take a downward angle to go through Conley's body. And it's a stupid, I can't explain it any more accurately. It is a stupid conclusion about the wounds to the president and Governor Conley. By the way, they took Governor Conley's suit and which should have been put into evidence because they could have got metal samples from the holes in his clothes and so forth, and bullet fragments to compare to the other. But they took and laundered his suit and shirt before it was turned into evidence.
You know, I remember, I believe I was 10 or 11 years old when this occurred, and I remember my grandparents just mumbling at the report of this magic bullet, and I can still see the scene in Stone's JFK where Kevin Costner, describes the idiotic theory of this bullet. And I just wonder how anyone in America could have actually bought it. Sure, I don't believe Americans did, but yeah, they were probably scared to ask the question.
Well, the CIA, got to some friendly editors and the writers and so forth, and the American people were never really told this.
Right.
Our books, some of them became popular and changed and educated some people about this, but that's a small minority of the people that are brainwashed with the media's mythical story of a lone assassin.
Yeah.
Right. Wow. So in the book, Dr. Crenshaw recounts this stranger than fiction events related to Oswald's being wheeled into Parkland ER 2 days after the team of the others tried to save President Kennedy in Trauma Room 1. So again, Crenshaw and his colleagues are there, but this time they use Trauma Room 2 simply out of courtesy and respect for the president. So, but oddly, in the ER, as the ER team worked to save Oswald, Crenshaw was made possible by his being free at the moment, is asked to take a phone call in the other room. So, quote, this is what he says. "This is Dr. Crenshaw, may I help you?" And on the other end of the line, it said, "This is President Lyndon B. Johnson. Dr. Crenshaw, how's the accused assassin?" So tell us about the scene.
Well, it was a crazy scene. When he called, he talked first to the desk, the receptionist there at Parkland, and she had to transfer the call. Her name was Phyllis, and we interviewed her, and she wrote a letter stating the very same thing that Dr. Crenshaw stated, is that it was President Johnson calling. But she transferred it to Trauma Room 2, where actually Dr. Crenshaw was the one that suggested to the doctors when they brought Oswald in, let's don't put him in the same room we had the president, out of respect. And so the phone call came in and transferred, and they tapped Crenshaw. We don't know who. It was someone there in the operating room. Tapped him on the shoulder, says, "Can you take a call?" And he said, I can. I'm free right now. And he did. And when he picked up the phone and said, "This is Dr. Crenshaw, how can I help you?" Everybody recognizes Lyndon Johnson's voice. And he came on asking for that. And like I've said previously, there was more than one, but at least one in there that was armed, had donned the garb of a surgeon, and was there just as as President Johnson said, to take death with confession from Oswald. And he's probably the same one. It may have been the other one, may have been that one that hollered in Oswald's ear, "Did you do it? Did you do it?" And that was witnessed by other doctors and testified to. So there's more to Dr. Crenshaw's story about this strange phone call, and it's documented. In fact, this receptionist, when the Dallas Morning News wrote an editorial, and they bring that out, and President Johnson calling Dr. Crenshaw. That's a bunch of bull. Basically, is what they said. She wrote a letter and said it did happen, and they wouldn't publish it.
Of course.
Wouldn't publish it.
You know, Gary, most of us know that it wasn't long after that phone call that Oswald actually died, without having lived long enough to provide that ordered deathbed confession that Johnson was looking for. You know, thanks to Ruby, the president's accused assassin was indeed dead. Whatever information he had or could have shed light on about the assassination was forever silenced. I'm just curious. I have my own theories, but why did Oswald, in your opinion, have to be eliminated?
Have to be eliminated?
Yes.
I think it's real simple. They gathered evidence, and I say gathered, I think they manufactured some of it, but they put together evidence that indicated that it was Oswald in the 6th floor window, and that he fired 3 shots, and 2 of them actually hit someone. And, they framed him. That's what I'm saying. They did not have enough evidence, or did not have any evidence, as far as I'm concerned, that was stood up in court and convicted him as the killer, the lone killer of President Kennedy. And therefore, I think he had to die.
In other words, he
You
could
say,
never be
well, that
brought to
was-
trial.
Yeah. If they brought it to trial, what are they going to do?
Yeah.
This guy didn't do it. We got to go look and see who did. And they certainly didn't want to do that.
Right.
Yeah. No serious investigation.
None.
Yeah. Well, as you know far too well, considerable effort was made by a variety of Parkland physicians to via false sworn affidavits, publish JAMA, the American Medical Association Journal, articles, op-eds in high-profile newspapers and others to discredit anyone who disagreed with Warren Commission's final report to the American people. So initially, these attacks were fostered and encouraged via a document,
Which you referred to.
yeah, which you referred to earlier by the CIA Director Helms.
Right.
So tell us, so you described this, but what are some other methods that they may have used via this document?
Well, and more importantly, how did it impact you and Dr. Crenshaw?
How did it impact you and Dr. Crenshaw?
Well, number one is that they obviously got a hold of a publisher and an editor who was sympathetic, more than one of those,
Wow.
who was sympathetic to their desires to continue to conceal the truth about the president's death. And to normally a story like they did, actually it was a 2-part story in the JAMA magazine. To do a story like that normally takes months. They did it within a few weeks, and it came out. And normally they didn't hold a press conference when they published their magazine. I think it was a monthly magazine. It went out to doctors primarily, but they called a huge press conference, and a compliant press, covered it. And a compliant press wrote editorials denigrating Dr. Crenshaw and his opinions about that day. And so it was, these are hard-hitting people. And when I say the CIA, I don't mean all the CIA agents in the world. I'm talking about there was some people in there that thought they knew better how to run the world than did the politician. And I take exception to it.
Well, as you said, we've brought up this slide right here because these are the 2 journal articles you're talking about, May 27 article and the October 7, 92 article that were both, I was floored by the title, JFK's Death, the Plain Truth from the MDs who did the autopsy. That it floored me just to even see the title of this article. And these 2 are pictures. This would be Dennis Brio, And Dr. George Lundberg. Dr. Lundberg was at that time editor of the Journal of American Medical Association, and Brio would be the journalist that he called in. This is the same MO. Do we not see this in media today?
Yeah, absolutely, I think. And, if we had a legitimate media, our most of the stories that you see and put out as news is actually propaganda. They don't just report on an incident or something that happened. They've got to opine on it. In other words, they've got to offer their opinion, and that's not news. That belongs not on the front page, but on an opinion page. I don't mind them writing opinion, but I don't want it.
Yeah.
Gary, as we were talking about this again this afternoon, it's just crossed my mind that for most Americans, all of this information is literally enough to make their heads spin in utter confusion, and honestly, with all the information coming from all the directions, it's easy to get confused about what we actually know and what we do not know in regard to what happened on November 22, 63. I know you've done some thinking about it in recent days about, getting down to the KISS principle about keeping it simple, stupid. Can you tell us a little bit about what we know versus what we really do not know?
Again, we could spend weeks talking about that. But the fact of the matter is that there has been information put out that is false. It's propaganda. There's information that's put out that is not only wrong, but detrimental to truth and justice as we know it in this, or should know it in this country, and once did. And it's people like these two guys you've got on the screen right there. Dr. Lundberg was fired a few years later for writing stories that were not truthful, so to speak. And Brio, he actually got an award for the two articles that he wrote about Dr. Crenshaw and the Parkland and Bethesda doctors. And that later they took it away from him and said he obviously didn't do his homework. And so both of them look bad when it's over. We sued both of them, and JAMA, American Medical Association, Dr. Crenshaw and I, and we settled out of court, and we won the battle. if we didn't win the war.
Do you wish you could have seen the courtroom, the inside of the courtroom?
Absolutely, and had Dr. Crenshaw had already had 2 strokes, and he was really the day that we negotiated, and he was running a fever, and we thought, man, this is not good. We didn't know whether he's going to make it through the day. And so when we settled, he was grateful and went home, and sure enough, he had influenza and was ran a high fever. And so, yes, I wish we could have got it in court. We would have made him look like idiots again.
Wow. Again. So Gary, during President Trump's term, specifically 2018, a lot of excitement surrounded the release of new documents, assassination documents. Was anything really important released?
Yes, and in fact, we're still looking at it. One of the things that I wanted to talk about is the release of the documents, and you bring it out a little bit later. But one of the things that came out that was kind of funny about that, when the documents started being released because of the JFK movie and the establishment of the Assassination Records Review Board, when they started forcing the National Archives to release documents, they came out with many redactions, and still many are withheld. But there's been a lot of good stuff that have opened the door to further investigation. And I think just like after the Warren Commission, it took 3 or 4 years for the books to start hitting and really revealing the truth about what happened that day. But it's funny, one of the things that happened out of that, the release of those records, was I call it, they're still trying, because a couple of what I call Johnny come latelys, the JFK assassination, where a guy named Larry Sabato and a man by the name of Philip Shannon, and the two men jointly and promptly, after some of the release of the records, wrote a news article, and it came out in August of 2017. And here's their statement, which I thought was hilarious. Quote, "None of the files released last week undermines the Warren Commission finding that Oswald killed Kennedy with shots from his perch on the 6th floor of the Texas School Book Depository in Dallas's Dealey Plaza, a conclusion supported by 21st century forensic analysis, and that there was no evidence of a second gunman." Well, number one, they couldn't have read the whole documents. There were, I think there were 3,810 released right at that point, new documents released, many of them redacted and some of them completely redacted. And it had been only a week or so after those released that they make this statement. Well, in fact, it's 10 days. And the funny thing is they make this statement, and they would have had to have read thousands of pages, first of all, and digest what they read. In other words, understand it, and also compare them to earlier related documents and evidence and conclusions, and then write and edit their article all within 10 days. And it's impossible. And the only rational conclusion I could come up with for such a humanly impossible task is that the preparation of the article must have been initiated by others well before the document was even released. And I put it this way: the two men could only be adjudged to be liars who are engaging in the mass dissemination of disinformation. They are therefore propagandists, and that's the best I could say about it.
Yeah, man, I love how you call it like it is. It seems to me that the powers that be have gone to beyond great lengths to peddle the same old false information, baseless conclusions that support the Warren Commission and even the HSCA. And honestly, I believe that those powers, whoever they are, count on the public staying uninformed. I mean, you just talked about the fact that there were 3,800 documents. I mean, honestly, who's going to sit down and sort through it all? Personally, I've run across people every year, almost every week, who know almost nothing about this huge subject. I really believe that those powers count on the American public staying silent. And the longer the lies are perpetrated on the American public, the greater the threat.
Well, and that's true. And yet we're teaching our children, go play with your little electronic devices.
Yes.
Don't learn anything, and we've become a people who are blind and deaf to what's really going on around us.
Yes.
And we don't do anything. And
Right.
that's what I'm fighting for, is that we could finally get to the point where we could admit that this happened and hold accountable those. We can't hold accountable the ones who did it, because they're probably long dead. But we could hold accountable the media people and the politicians and those who have continued to propagate and this absolute lie about how the president died. I was kind of saving this toward the last. I don't know how close we are to last.
We're getting close,
But-
my friend.
Okay, one of the things that I learned recently is that there was a guy in 1943 by the name of Major Carlton Coon. He was actually a anthropologist, but he was also part of the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services, which is the predecessor to the CIA, of course.
Exactly.
And the director at that time was William Donovan. And this Major Coon handed him a detailed report that he had written advocating agency adoption of political assassination as an instrument of state policy and the formalization of an ultra elite assassination bureau. And here's what he said. This is a quote. The world is now too small and too tight to permit continuation of the process of trial and error. A mistake made in one quarter will of necessity spread rapidly all over the world, for all our apples are now in one barrel. And if one rots, the lot is destroyed. We cannot be sure that the clear and objective scholars who study the existing social systems and draw blueprints for a society to suit our technology will always be heard, or that their plans will be put into operation. We can almost be assured that this will not be the case. What they were worried about, what he was talking about, was Hitler. You know, what if Hitler had been assassinated in 1935?
Right.
Yeah.
You know, and it's something to think about. And he goes on to say, therefore, some other power, some third class of individuals, aside from the leaders and scholars, must exist. And this third class must have the task of thwarting mistakes, diagnosing areas of political and world disequilibrium, and nipping the causes of potential disturbances in the bud. Listen to this. There must be a body of men whose task it is to throw out the rotten apples as soon as the first spots of decay appear. A Hitler. A body of this nature must exist under cover. It must either be a power unto itself or be given the broadest discretionary powers by the highest human authorities. Who are these men? I believe exist. Who appointed these men? Are they self-appointed? Just where are they? What are they? And what are the decisions they're making that affect yours and my life? And who decides who needs to be assassinated and who gets to live? It's a scary little proposal that he made, and I believe they put it into operation. And if we could find the people that are doing this, we'd be better off today.
They're judge and jury without a country, answerable to no one.
Right. Absolutely.
Wow. Well, Gary, as we start to close this out, what can you tell our audience about continuing research? Is it all over, or is there new revelations on the horizon?
There are new revelations. I'm reading an excellent manuscript for another writer and making suggestions and so forth. It's going to, it's already made me re-examine who I thought might be behind it. Let me go real quickly. I don't know who did it. I just know who didn't do it. And yeah, that's a start. And this manuscript, when the book comes out, I think will open a lot of eyes to some individuals that most people have never heard of and really don't want to hear of them. But there are other people that are still working.
I'm really encouraged to hear that, because we're all getting older.
That's right.
And every day I get concerned about young people getting involved and caring about what has happened. As we prepare to close out, Gary, any final thoughts that you'd like to share with us in regard to a kind of assigned reading for those who are relatively new to the assassination subject? It's such a deep and complicated subject. The books are that I would recommend would be
some that are relatively old because they're what started me. And you can't read a lot of the new material because you don't have the background to
Right.
read and understand the material. So it's a situation where I think we've got to educate the people that and young people I'm talking about, because I'm 83 years old soon to be, and my time is running out, and we need some young soldiers to come on.
Yeah.
And because how can you continue to build upon a lie?
Mhm.
You
That's
can't.
right.
And we've tried to do that, and you can see what it's brought us.
Well, Gary, you referred to some of the books that have been around a while, and some of your writings are certainly in that list. I have some friends who tried to acquire some of your older writings. They just almost can't find them. Do you have any recommendations about how our audience can get copies of your older works and, of course, your newer ones?
I wish I did. I'm trying to put together now and republish portions of Cover Up and new information that I've gathered since then, and I'm still gathering even today. And some of the older articles that I've written that saw very, very limited, circulation among people. And if I could combine that into a book, that would be helpful. I treat everything as simple as possible.
Right.
I believe that the simpler you can make your description and your explanations, more people will be able to understand and want to do something about it. If you fill them full of a bunch of technical terms and technical apparatus, you're not going to get very far, because they've got to almost go back to school to understand what you're talking about.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I don't want that.
Well, Gary, thank you so much for making time for 3 in 1 today. And talking to you has been a privilege and very enlightening. Michael and I are certainly hoping that you'll come back to the show and cover other aspects of this huge subject.
I will be happy to do that, and I've got some good things that I can cover. I don't even want to mention now, because it would open up another can of worms, and we'd be on for weeks. And I can't afford it, neither can you.
Well, I understand it is a vast subject, and we certainly look forward to talking to you again in the near future. And for today, I guess that, excuse me?
Can I close with just one little short thing?
Absolutely.
Your book, you lived a complicated and misunderstood life from your mother was a woman who was wild as a March hare, as best I can put it.
Yes, she was.
And you know that. And she ran with people who were criminal, but she was also an informant for government agencies. And she tried to tell people that the president was going to be shot when he went to Dallas, and they ignored her. And they ignored her when they were told that she knew who the men were that were going to Dallas to get that done. And so I wanted to point that out to the people, that I hope you'll buy Michael's and Kelly's book on his mother, Rose Sheremy, and tell your friends and neighbors about it. One of the things I noticed in that, one of the things that got me involved in all of this was my knowledge of Dallas, of the strip clubs and so forth that were in operation. And I had sat at the table with Jack Ruby and heard the rumors of his organized crime attachments, among other things. And so I had some semblance of knowledge about what was going on. So when he shot Oswald and took him out so he couldn't go to trial and talk about what happened. But the 3 of the strippers for Jack Ruby are important. And this is one of the stories I want to write about. And it includes your mother, of course, Rose. The Warren Report was due out in September of '64. In other words, less than a year after the president's death, and it was going to declare no conspiracy. And there were these three strippers needed to be quiet. And so on July of 1964, one of the strippers named Jada, that was her stage name, was arrested in another state and taken into custody. This was just before the Warren report is due out. A few weeks later, another Ruby stripper, Little Lynn Carlin, was arrested in Fort Worth, put into jail. She was charged with indecent exposure. And later she shut up, kept quiet, and she lived to be 65. Jada lived to be only 45. But then there's Rose, your mother, who was arrested in October of 1964, less than a month before the Warren report was coming. There is no doubt in my mind that these women who knew Jack Ruby up close and personal and had talked about Lee Harvey Oswald and Jack Ruby working together in this sort of thing were not coincidental arrests. They were telling them to keep their mouths shut.
Exactly.
Little Lynn did, Rose didn't, and Rose didn't live much over another year after they made contact with her. So, and I want to stress that and tell them to be sure and buy your book and,
I appreciate that, Gary.
read the true story.
Thank you. I've devoted half my life to this research, but I
I know
appreciate
you
that. Yes, it's quite a story. Well,
But
Gary,
it's a
we
pleasure.
thank you.
It's been a pleasure and a joy to be with you guys. You know, I love you, and
Yes, Gary.
we'll do most anything for you.
We love you too, my friend. Well, I guess that wraps it up for part 2 of 3 and 1's inaugural series, Kelly. We hope you out there in the listening land will follow us on our new Facebook page. You can find information about our podcast on Spotify, the Apple Podcast listings, and more regarding the final posting of this show and others in the near future. Again, thanks for listening today. But for now,
I'm Kelly.
and I'm Michael, and 3 and 1 is done for today. We'll be back soon.